Welcome back. So I think it's simply become a fact of life that my upload schedule will be sporadic. But hey, we've made it to chapter 3, which in my opinion is really where the pack begins to shine. Now, because of the whole intermission video, I have a significant advantage when approaching this chapter, even though I haven't actually touched any of its content yet. Before I get started though, I think it'd be best if I sort of outline my goals in this chapter, as I've realized my videos can be hard to follow without knowing exactly what I'm working towards. Basically, for the early parts, I'm working towards nuclear reactors, and then later on we're going to do some space exploration before we finish up the chapter. So yeah, it's time to start off this chapter by making some mystical agriculture seeds. It turns out deep mob learning just isn't the right mod for producing the amount of fiery steel I need, so while I didn't disable the setup, I did make a much faster setup over in the mystical agriculture area. Now, unlike Chapter 2, Chapter 3 has a lot more direction in terms of what we're doing, with significantly less side quest chasing. Actually, I'm just gonna jump right into the first progression milestone, the Terra Piata Warper. While this recipe looks disastrous, in all honesty, essentially every component is already being produced in my void miners, with the only outlier being the wormhole catalyst, which I crafted at the end of Chapter 2. Unlike in older versions of Meatballcraft, I can't just right-click the warper and expect it to actually bring me anywhere. Instead, I have to build a wormhole field generator, which will supposedly open up a portal for me to travel through. I don't know if this was intentional, but building this multi-block was actually more of a process than crafting the wormhole itself, as it required a rather large amount of dimensional shards, along with some cases from Tech Reborn, which are frustratingly tedious to craft, especially considering they need a drop from the King of Scorchers, who currently resides on Would Rather Not Fight Again list. After I had all the materials gathered, I built the wormhole generator in a temporary area near my alloy automation. Temporary areas are kind of a trend during this chapter, as I tried going at a slightly faster pace than last time, which actually shows in the runtime of the video. Regardless, I set up the device and used the Terra Piata Warper to enter my first completely progression-based custom dimension. Terra Piata looks awfully similar to the overworld, doesn't it? Well, other than a few important structures, which are really why we're here in the first place. A funny thing about Meatballcraft is that the devs might be a little trigger happy when it comes to spawning bosses in their custom dimensions. This is why you are currently seeing me fight through a cloud of withers. After the withers were dealt with, I was able to access this small pyramid thing that contained a draconic upgrade key, which also happens to be the key to progressing further. Once done frolicking in the only slightly wither-infested fields, I decided to automate the production of deep blue matter, which was unlocked upon obtaining the draconic upgrade key. Admittingly, automating this stuff was a complete waste of time as it does have EMC, but the cost is rather high and its constituents have other uses, so I may as well produce it anyway. The first part I automated were spirit fruits from the Betweenlands. Thankfully, I already had some spirit tree saplings on hand, so I just shoved them into a phytogenic insulator and continued on. The rest of the setup was pretty simple, though I did move it into my basement as the liquid corallium duping device needed more room than my main automation hallway could provide. With the construction of a Valinite gateway, deep blue matter was automated, although I'll only end up using this setup for its production like once. I think I've said this before, but I really don't enjoy extended crafting. There's just too many items to manage in one grid, and I honestly think using complex production chains instead of one-time resource sinkholes is a better way to make item production difficult. That being said, I may as well make it slightly less of a hassle with an ultimate extended crafting terminal. I didn't even know this thing existed before, but damn, once I get my AE2 setup fully operational, this bad boy is going to save a lot of time. Completely ignoring my new terminal, with the assistance of some deep blue matter, I made the Radiating Callstone, which got me a Thorium and Uranium Princess. I don't really use them because of how powerful mystical agriculture is, but I guess they could become useful if there's any major resource strain later on. Now, with my upgraded crafting terminal, I crafted a Diamerisma Warper, which is a second dimension on our to-do list. Before entering though, I relocated my wormhole generator over to a slightly more accessible area, because let's be honest here, a wormhole generator deserves a better location than next to some arc furnaces. Alright, so Diamerisma is awfully similar to the overworld too. Huh. And there's a ton of dragons. Yeah, so the boss spam is not going away anytime soon. The goal here isn't too complicated though, as killing some giants should be all I need to do here. That being said, there are some nice bees hanging around for the taking, along with some more draconic upgrade keys. Also, there was the spider box. We do not talk about what happened inside the spider box. I got the spider's egg, that's all that matters. Alright, time for the third and final warper dimension for this chapter, Ferrado. Regrettably, this bad boy requires a Horcrux to craft, which means I gotta construct some strange multi-blocks that are basically an exercise in how willing you are to grind Abyssalcraft. Gonna speed through this actually, it really isn't that interesting. And we're in Ferrado. Hey, these ghasts aren't even bosses. The devs must be going easy on me. Nope. Someone thought it would be a good idea to put an ender chicken here. And that's an army of watchers. Hey, I did get some upgrade keys though. With those dimensions out of the way, it's time to do some home improvement. First off, I built a Lilith altar to turn some of the mana juice my bewitchment area is producing into some mystical agriculture essences for the sake of Advent of Ascension and Divine RPG or automation. I also increased the amount of water flowing into my reactors, as apparently they were boiling it faster than it was being provided, reducing power output. Not that power is currently an issue, though. On the topic of reactors, it's time to start producing uranium. You see, this chapter is what I like to call the nuclear craft chapter, as much of its progression is building fission reactors. That means I need a steady source of uranium along with some other nuclear fuels. As with half the resources in the game, uranium has a handy mystical agriculture seed, which was shortly automated. Keeping in line with my nuclear craft ambitions, I automated extreme alloy in an admittingly jank setup. While it isn't used too much, I do need it for radiation scrubbers, which will come in handy if there's ever an accident, if you know what I mean. Of course, if I'm going to start building a bunch of reactors, they gotta have somewhere to go. So I built a new area of the base over in the Void. I find it best to put distance between your main infrastructure and your array of just barely not overheating explosion boxes. Anyway, now that I've got a platform to build off, it's time to continue automating nuclear craft resources. Or, well, I guess re-automating them. During the whole moving into a void world thing, I never moved the borax production I set up in chapter 2, and it turns out that I kinda need that stuff to progress. So, yeah, I install borax production into my nuclear craft area. Surprisingly, some of the advanced nuclear craft plates in Meatballcraft are somehow even more expensive than they are in the vanilla mod, meaning I'm going to have to automate materials like enhanced ender ingots, keeping in mind this is one of those let's add another star to make the recipe more expensive type recipes. Actually, automating the ingot wasn't too difficult because of the handy dandy crafting interfaces working with ender crafters, but getting more nether stars required a visit to our good friend, the Nethanjaic Wither, and I mean a lot of Nethanjaic Withers. But hey, we've got our nether stars on passive. After a bit of ender crafter and alloy smelter conflangling, I've also got ender stars and enhanced ender ingots automated. And yeah, I did put the setup in the nuclear craft area even though they're from ender utilities. Look, I need to keep my nuclear craft plate material automation close together. Do I look like I'm made out of AE2 channels? Regrettably, the next 30 minutes of footage got corrupted after a power outage interrupted my recording, so I can only really tell you what happened. And when I say tell you what happened, I mean read off my notes on what happened, which say, I made isotope separators for uranium and began the automation of crystal binder, which is another one of those plating ingredients. Anyway, the footage picks back up with me continuing to automate crystal binder. This includes the automation of sulfuric acid, which as a sussy player, I can really appreciate. Along with the crystal binder, I also had to automate flux plates. This is at least the third time I've done this, and I'm beginning to regret not automating them in the central system. With all the requisite items having been obtained, I can now automate DU plating, which is not only useful in its own right, but it is the next step towards elite plating. In fact, with the additional automation of crystalline catalysts, all I need to do is build the autocrafter for elite plating. So there we go. Nuclear craft components have been automated. Well, except for all the ones that I didn't automate, but that's for later. For now, I've got to produce some more radioactive goodies. Starting off with thorium. Should be a simple seed operation, right? Well, yeah, but the time has finally come for me to expand my farming area. So, yeah, there we have it. Anyway, now it's time for the good stuff. And by good stuff, I mean automating all the blocks I need to build like a dozen nuclear reactors, because apparently nuclear craft is going to become my full-time occupation. I've already collected a massive stock of reactor casings throughout the intermission, so it would be logical to automate the second most important block of the reactor, its coolant cells. Out of all the strange materials required to craft them, the only one that will pose a challenge is the resplendent ingot, as it requires a starlight infuser to be crafted. It's not like I don't already have one automatically running in the basement, it's just that fitting it into my awkward automation space is a hassle, but hey, I gotta do what I gotta do. So cases are automated, coolers are automated, turns out that's all you really need to build a reactor. The first one, of course, used typical uranium fuel, because apart from extreme reactors, uranium is always the go-to fuel for reactor mods. But we're not stopping there. Oh no baby, it's time to go nuclear. Next up is a thorium reactor, which is just as simple as the uranium one. But to continue, I need to start reprocessing fuel, as it turns out other radioactive isotopes can't be found naturally. While the waste from my uranium and thorium reactors is being processed, I start collecting helium using these really convenient blocks called helium collectors. You see, the next reactor I need to build, the high-energy uranium-233 reactor, runs really hot and it requires some helium coolers in order to get its coolant configuration right. So while the fuel is reprocessing and the helium is being collected, I finally built some of those radiation scrubbers I was talking about earlier. I'm just saying, better be safe than sorry. Once my helium collectors were done collecting, I built a HEU reactor and its reprocessing assembly. Next up on the old assembly line were two MOX reactors. Interestingly, unlike every other nuclear fuel, I need to infuse MOX fuel with oxygen, because I guess that's just how it works. Not only that, but their waste products don't even contribute to the rest of the fuel line. So I'm pretty sure the only reason the quest book has me making this stuff is for future crafting recipes or something. Going back to the main chain though, it's time to make reactors for both low energy and high energy plutonium as well as americium. We ain't done stacking gray boxes yet though. Next up we got low and high energy curium, followed by low energy berkelium. So yeah, that's a lot of reactors, but we still need one more, high energy californium. But when I say high energy, I mean this stuff is high energy. So I've got to wait for my helium collectors to go and do their thing. In the meantime, I install an elevator on this bad boy, because damn, flying up and down all 12 reactors takes forever. Is that the pleasant squeak of helium in my ears? Well, I guess it's time to install our californium reactor. I'm not gonna lie, this whole reactor tower thing has been some of the most fun I've had with this pack. Is it efficient? No, not really. But I'd be lying if I said it wasn't satisfying to build. Of course, now that it's been built, there's like 26 4x4 drawers or something filled with radioactive isotopes just sitting around my reprocessing modules. So it's probably best I get it hooked up to my ME system. Along with the ME installation, I'm going to spend some time building a facade for this thing, because right now it is sort of a giant eyesore. The facade even comes with high-tech features like elevator lights. Damn, that is one spanking tower right there. So, I've automated some weird radioactive isotopes using 13 reactors in a stack that looks about as stable as a snowman built 5 days after a first node. But why? Quest progression, baby! I'm not gonna need whatever isotopes this thing is shitting out till next chapter. That being said, I think it's time to do some things that will more directly contribute to progression. The Bloodmaster Tome is the next big jump in progression and gates the next tiers of mythical void miners. Being such an item, it requires some strange resources. While the Chiroma barbs, radioactive fuels, and blank slates are accounted for, that purple crystal thing, known in scholarly circles as a soul shard, is going to be a massive pain. Basically, it's the type of item where you need to kill a certain number of mobs before it will activate, and this knockoff amethyst requires the slaughter of an entire generation of blazes. Thankfully, this is Meatballcraft, so there is a very simple way around the whole operation. The Soul Stealer is a special version of the Vile Sword that infuses the gem with way more souls than what you actually killed per kill. And while its recipe is very reminiscent of the types of recipes that cause the existence of Avaridia, like seriously 6 blocks of nether stars, it really isn't the end of the world. So after some time floundering around trying to gather the souls with the enchantment, I give in to the sword's power, and after a small wither massacre in an off-world location, I've got the sword along with the blaze souls I need, giving me access to the Bloodmaster Tome. I'm not sure why a book about what I can only assume to be bleeding to death teaches how to craft purple blocks called Nether Sky Amber, but I've learned asking questions only brings up more, so I guess I'll just get to crafting it. Oh man, that's a lot of statues of dead guys. Well, it turns out I can actually dupe them. So yeah, there's the Nether Sky Amber, and as is tradition, I'm not going to actually progress now that I've got the thing that allows me to. Instead, we're going knee-deep into environmental tech void miners. I mean, technically you do need the structure blocks for mythic miners, but let me pretend to stray from the path of progression, would ya? First off, automating interconnects is a good idea, as these things are a pain in the ass to craft, and the process would significantly speed up if I didn't have to think about them. Next up, I automate up to tier 4 structure blocks, which allows me to then build a tier 4 void miner and upgrade it to tier 5, then 6 in swift procession. And what will I do with it? Leave it alone. Yep, we do not have any ore processing, and all this shit is not going to clog up some random black hole units, so we are leaving everything in the basement. Actually, speaking of black hole units, the current AE2 network for handling mythic miner items is collapsing in on itself and giving me a slew of problems, so I think I'll just replace the drives with storage buses and black hole units, as that is far less likely to cause any problems, and by the time they fill up, I'll probably be dead. I then spend the next hour and a half installing more black hole units, because apparently I need way more than I thought I did. Like, damn, I started to feel bad for those old ME drives. These items suck. You know what? Actually, I think it's time to add to the problem. Terragenic Mythical Void Miner, here we come. Hey Nether Sky Amber, remember when I crafted you then you got abandoned so I could build lasers going into the void? Well, I'm glad to say you'll finally realize your potential. Despite the miner being assembled, I can't use it yet, because the Terragenic Mythical Void Miner needs weak mythic essence to function, which in all honesty is sort of a process to make. The first step is retrieving another one of those mechanized coops, as apparently chickens can hatch out cold iron or something. Once the chickens get to laying, I infuse their eggs with marginal mythic essence, something that's already being produced for our other void miners. I'm pretty sure it used to be called something different before an update, but I can't quite remember what it was called. Anyway, the cold iron becomes Nether Sky Steel once infused, which is destined to be crushed up and combined with some random items from my void miners in order to make ever-watching eyes, which for the fans should be a familiar item, as they are lauded for their pivotal role in the Botania saga from episode 2. The ever-watching eyes make really fresh weak mythical essence when squeezed, so I get a machine for that and hug it up to the Terragenic Void Miner, which begins to produce a bunch of random items that I know will be important later on, but I don't really care for at the moment. Some of these items are boatloads, and I mean boatloads of fish. I don't know about you, but I consider myself too thrifty to go and make a black hole unit for each individual fish this thing is spitting out, so I think I need to find an alternative purpose for these guys. It could be argued throwing them into a trash can would be the best option, but I disagree. There is an item known as mythic matter, which like everything won't necessarily be useful at the moment, but I'll need it later on. I can tell how important this stuff will be because there's about 500 million different ways to craft it, and they're all relatively cheap. This suggests I'll probably need like millions of it or something. Anyway, one of those recipes is using the fish the miner is producing, and a Corallus lung. Was fighting Corallus enough to have a basic tier DML model of him really worth an infinite passive supply of mythic matter? I think that's one of those arguments that can really go either way, because damn, fighting Corallus sucks. With the fish problem sorted out, I go and install all the black hole units for the bajillion or so items seeping from the Terragenic miner's pores. Seriously, why'd they have to go and make item management such a chore? I mean, eventually the fish just started to seep out of the mythic matter automation and into the storage and began blocking everything, so I had to reroute everything like a bum. Don't you worry though, it's only time to make this problem worse. The Netherjaic Mythical Void Miner is calling, and it refuses to take a dial tone for an answer. Unfortunately, some of its components are slightly more involved than the Terragenic miners. First off, Crimson Quartz required some annoying items like more boss statues and a Wyvern core. But that's not really the problem. Dark Mithrilium requires Thaumcraft Infusion, which as we all know, I have a very stable relationship with. Yep. It's not really an expensive infusion, but spending 4 Mithrilium blocks is always gonna hurt. For some reason, before actually building the miner multi-block, I picked up my fusion reactor controller before just putting it back down. I'll be honest, I really don't know why I did that, but I felt like I should mention it just in case it was important. I'm assuming it was for quest purposes. The Netherjaic resource miner is, in my opinion, one of the best looking void miners. How could you possibly compete with the gleam of dark Mithrilium? It's not yet functional though, as like its sibling, it needs a special fluid to run. that being moderate mythical essence. Unlike weak mythical essence though, there's actually very little I need to do in the way of automation because everything it needs I've already automated. The 5 different types of will steel have been automated for a while now, and calcite crystals are produced by one of my void miners. The only thing I'm missing is the Bloodmaster Crucible, which isn't the cheapest thing ever, but that's just because of the Meatballcraft blocks, which automatically make everything more difficult for little reason. But yeah, after a bit of gallivanting around the abyss, and an upgrading output bus, the Netherjake Void Miner is fully operational. Do I even bother building some more black hole units? The answer is no, because it's time to go straight on to crafting parts for the next mythical Void Miner, which is going to be a doozy. First off, I need this really expensive wood. Terra Steel, Strange Runes, you name it, this wood needs it. Plus, eventually I've got to bake it in a fusion reactor while combining it with these Void Shurikens, which require some weird-ass fluids themselves. Well, thank you so much, Ender.io. I really appreciate the XP costs of all this. And the weird baked wood is only half the process. The other major block of the Enderjake Void Miner requires gathering some berries from Ferrado, killing those stupid Arakos in the end some more for their hearts, planting some saltpeter seeds, and making refined canola. But that's not all. Bee breeding is back, baby. Time to get the furtive comb. But bee breeding is a time-intensive process, so in the meantime, I'll go into the snow realm and kill some yetis for their crystals, because I guess those are also needed in this recipe? Like, I don't even know. After some gene finagling over at the laboratory, the bees have yielded me a furtive comb, meaning I can craft the most important block in the Enderjake Void Miner, called the Aroko Stone. You know, that name really makes sense, because crafting these things really did feel like fighting the Arakos for a few hours. Now, I'll be honest here, the Enderjake Void Miner isn't going to be operational for a while. There's this ingot called Dreaded Steel. Contrary to what you might think, it's not called this because it's playing off Ice and Fire's dreaded enemies. It's called Dreaded Steel because not a single Meatballcraft player doesn't dread making it. This is because it requires so much dragon steel, which is something that you either produce manually at the cost of your sanity, or automatically at the cost of eternal dragon fire, which may as well deplete your sanity because of how long it takes to produce. But whatever, you know, I'm just going to automate it anyway regardless of any possible side effects. Step 1, give the very expensive and very useless tier 6 void ore miner in my basement a purpose. Turns out plutonium is needed to make dragon blood artificially, and dragon blood is a key ingredient in making dragon steel. So yeah, time to turn a small part of my basement into a plutonium processing plant. Before installing any further dragon steel automation though, I've got to renovate pretty much the entire mythical void miner area. It is far too cramped and the fluid automation is haphazardly thrown together in a separate chunk. During this renovation, I also installed some more black hole units, so yay me, I guess. With the renovations complete, it's time to hunt down some dragons, as pretty much every device in the setup is going to need at least some scales, if not their hearts. Man, this pack really does not advertise how much dragon hunting is required to complete it, because I swear this is like a major part of the gameplay loop. The stack of dragon corpses is looking pretty high. Guess that means it's time to begin building eternal dragonfire automation. First off, this Dragonfire Forge will actually produce the juice, and this scary tower of Dragonfire Crucibles will consume it in order to produce Dragon Blood, Dragon Steel, and Dreaded Steel. With a little help from AE2 and some resources from the Mythical Void Miners, I've got Dragon Steel automated. Sort of. About this time, I realized that I thought Dreaded Steel was supposed to be crafted in a different multi-block than I thought it was, so I had to go out and extract some more Dragon Hearts for another Dragonfire Crucible. After that small hiccup though, I got Dreaded Steel automated, albeit very slowly. So this Dreaded Steel is using a crucible that allows me to make the juice for the Enderjake Void Miner, but isn't actually needed in the recipe. Okay, well actually it is, but only once. The Netherjake rune, one of the juice's components, does require a Dreaded Steel ingot, but once the Netherjake rune has been crafted once, it can be used to duplicate itself at no Dreaded Steel cost. That's a double-edged sword though, because yes, it means I don't have to use the incredibly hard to produce Dreaded Steel in a passively consumed fluid, but it also means I haven't actually started on automating the fluid at all. And as part of a trend I'm beginning to notice, this fluid is harder to produce than the last. The first resource that needs to be automated is transformation powder from the Twilight Forest. This is a really tedious process as the machine it's crafted in requires some strange essentia from Thaumcraft, which in turn requires a witch's oven setup from Bewitchment. Once that was out of the way though, the rest of the process was easy. After the first craft, Netherjake runes only need some items that can be spit out of a DML magic box. the transformation powder, and a copy of itself, which was easy enough to implement using this highly sophisticated runic altar automation. Vazkey would be so proud. You know when you're planning material costs out in your head and you only do mental math, so you end up severely miscalculating how much of a resource you need, and it turns out you undershot so bad you're going to be trying to make up the resource losses for the foreseeable future? Because it turns out I need way more dreaded steel than I previously thought to make the multi-block. But it's automated passively, right? Well, yes, but it's not running all the time because the resources the Dragonfire Forge was using to make Eternal Dragonfire aren't being produced fast enough by my mythic miners. Turns out the best way to do this is build a greenhouse and grow some spicy peppers, so that's what I'm going to do next. It's interesting how Eternal Dragonfire has like 7 different recipes and not a single one is able to produce it quickly. Anyway, building the greenhouse is easier said than done, as not only does this greenhouse require some really strange blocks. Photonium? Are you kidding me? But I need to do some forestry tree breeding in order to get the peppers, so that's always a blast. Oh, did I mention the grass floor of the greenhouse that needs a really strange block from Botania that requires a black lotus to be consumed in order to be created and has to be moved around using a rune from blood magic? Because for some reason that was a thing. All that aside though, eventually the greenhouse was operational and feeding my Dragonfire Forge with peppers, giving me a bunch of time to just sit around and wait for the dreaded steel to be produced. In this time, I began giving the area a facade, but at some point my impatience gets the best of me and I go on a small killing spree for both Dragon Blood, as that cuts out an entire step of the process in the production line, and Divine Shards, because those are the key to making a lot of Eternal Dragonfire very fast. I actually would be using the Divine Shard recipe by default if it wasn't so expensive to automate, though it is definitely something I'll look into eventually. Looks like killing a bunch of dragons and floating eye dudes really is the best way to fast track everything, because I am now the proud owner of a Dreading Crucible, which is fully capable of making strong mythic essence for my Ender Jake Void Miner. Oh man, that is far too much meaningful progression. I think it's time to sit back, relax, and do some side quests. Starting off easy, the Fluix Historian Callstone does something. Not really sure what, but I'm sure it will be very useful and not be a useless rabbit hole. Anyway, the infusion recipe for this thing requires a lot of Master Wands, so many to the point where I think Nope! Turns out, I've got a bunch of wizards in another dimension that are willing to sell them to me. I've just got to clear out all the obnoxious eye guys because I don't want this venue of interdimensional trade to be blasted into oblivion. After a rather scary infusion, I've crafted the Callstone, which summons this wonderful Skystone mansion. Inside is a phasing Fluix construct, which needs to be activated using souls. Honestly, this is where this operation starts to fall apart. Initially, I thought it was meant for you to capture souls in Ender IO soul vials. No, it needs me to capture them through Draconic Evolution's Reaper enchantment. Did I mention by the time I realized this, I had already gathered all the souls? In order to alleviate this mistake, I decided to craft the super enchanted weapon War, which is a process in of itself, but doesn't nearly compare to the process of using the mob duplicator to slowly spawn in mobs then have a slight chance of extracting their soul. This entire operation took hours, and to really top it all off, the recipe didn't even work. Yeah, I'm gonna be honest here, I didn't even know what I was doing wrong, so I sort of just did the thing when you cheat in the item the recipe is supposed to craft and throw away its constituents so you can pretend you crafted it seamlessly. But then afterward, I realized the next step in this rabbit hole requires more resources than I'm currently capable of producing, so I just threw in the towel and decided to change priorities because this whole thing just sucked. In order to cope with the several hours I wasted running around collecting souls, I decided to complete the easiest quest available to me: constructing a token totem. The token totem is a multi-block that converts tokens produced by mythic miners into energy, with higher level tokens producing more energy than lower level tokens. The problem with it is, though, the energy produced with, say, a tier 5 token will never equate to the amount of energy it took for the mythic miner to produce said token. So I just kinda let the totem lay dormant in the corner of my mythic miner area. Okay, seeing as the whole side quest thing didn't really work out, time to start progressing. And I mean in more ways than just building a stack of nuclear reactors. That's because we're going to space, baby! Well, not yet. as there's a pretty big checklist that stands between me and my first rocket launch. First off, I need an actual place to put all the machines that will help me get into space. Seeing as I want to keep my base at least somewhat compact so I don't have to load a lot of chunks, I've decided to put the space area above my mystical agriculture gardens. This will unfortunately cause all my greenhouse glass to be completely useless, and in order to prevent the efficiency losses blocking out the sun will cause, I'm crafting a bunch of lilies of fertility. Making all the lilies I'll need will take a while, so in the meantime I'm just building the walls of my space area, so as to not interfere with the crops yet. Eventually though, I finally meet what I've dubbed the lily threshold, and start giving the area a floor, which in my personal opinion is one of the worst floors I've ever built, but that's for another time. With the space area basically ready to be populated with machines, it's time to automate machine structures, which is a block that features prominently in Advanced Rocketry's multi-blocks and crafting recipes. This recipe has been made significantly more difficult than what was perhaps necessary, but there's nothing a wall of Tech Reborn plate benders can't do. Well, apparently there is actually. Machine structures need maze wafers, which are a specialty of the Twilight Forest. This means I have to employ another Carbonite Empowerer, along with a bunch of Thaumcraft Ascension nonsense. The Carbonite Empowerer is a very slow machine, and in a situation like machine structure automation, slow isn't really something I want to deal with. Fortunately, Meatballcraft has a solution, a special block I can insert into the multi-block to speed it up. Great! Except that block needs some very interesting items from around the Twilight Forest first, including the Maze Breaker, a piece of wool from the questing ram, and a block of maze stone. So after a lengthy expedition through a rather dingy maze, where absolutely no navigational mistakes were made at all, and a short stop at the questing ram, I made a block of empowered maze stone. Now that the Carbonite Empowerer is functional, I can finally send the rest of the items into the setup and produce my first machine structures. That means I can actually get to some advanced rocketry progression. First off, the saw, crystallizer, and assembler, as these guys will be necessary for making advanced rocketry circuits, which are actually incredibly cheap, it's just that they can take a while to produce. Another rather important resource for spaceflight is rocket fuel, which, much to my disappointment, is the default recipe of splitting up water in an electrolyzer and recombining the hydrogen and oxygen. I think it would have been cool to see rocket fuel have a more involved recipe like the one in Nomi Factory, but I think it's fair seeing how much work it takes to get to space in general outside of just making the rocket fuel. Getting slightly off track here, I spruce up the area a little, as having things like a ceiling and exterior walls really adds so much to the atmosphere. Straying even further from the track, I then craft the Warp Core and Warp Controller, devices that are used to navigate a space station around the galaxy. Basically, I saw that their recipes looked like a pain in the butt to do, and decided to do them ahead of time. In all honesty though, the recipes weren't too bad, although the sigils and pink slime ingots weren't necessarily very fun to produce. The rest of the recipes were just mostly stock stuff I had lying around or advanced rocketry circuits, which again aren't too difficult to craft. In terms of other prep work, I also make the space station and rocket assemblers along with some parts of the rocket. Sure, I don't even have a spacesuit, but these 70-something launch pad blocks are going to be really helpful. I swear. Actually, speaking of a spacesuit, I'm not going to craft one. Remember how long it took to obtain the armor I'm wearing right now? No way am I going to substitute this for some flimsy styrofoam coffee warmer jumpsuit. No. Instead, I'm going to wander around the end looking for the airtight seal enchantment, which turns your armor into a spacesuit. Gotta give props to the advanced rocketry devs for that one, really. Once I get everything all nice and enchanted, I borrowed some oxygen from down in the processing wing of the reactor area to fill in my air tanks and proceeded to build the launch pad. Much to my disappointment, you can't launch rockets from void worlds, so I had to put my launch pad on my now decrepit base in the overworld. This might be what could be considered anti-meta, but I enjoy giving my rocket like an actual body and stuff. Like, I'm building a spaceship here. Why should I just settle for a small thruster and a computer and a chair on top? Well, looks like fate didn't really like this idea, as when I used the rocket assembler to scan and, well, assemble my rocket, it defaced all the architecture blocks I was using and left me with the sad, rather blocky excuse for a ship. This won't stop my space ambitions though, because after this bad boy is done getting fueled up, I'm taking it to the moon. So, the moon is pretty much what you'd expect. It's gray, in space, and has bees living on it. Not really sure why the bees have been renamed to Mythical Excavation Queen from Celebratory Queen, but I collected them regardless because you never know when you need fireworks. Funnily enough, the only resource I actually need from the moon is its turf, as it can be processed into dilithium, which is the fuel for the warp core. So after gathering a small amount of the surface, I returned to the overworld and made some dilithium crystals. Except I didn't. You see, upon reaching the moon, a rather scary quest opened up that suggested I should automate all types of Thaumcraft Essentia. Typically, putting off quests like this is a one-way street to having the least fun you've ever had, so I decided to bite the bullet early and build a device I've dubbed the Apparatus. Step 1 of the process was making a lot of phytogenic insulators, as I need one per Essentia type. Phytogenic insulators? Aren't those for growing plants or something? Yes, they are. There is no reasonable way to automate every Essentia type through melting down resources that have the Essentia naturally occurring in them, so instead I'm going to extract the Essentia grown from pods in a massive array of phytogenic insulators. In order to operate, phytogenic insulators need more than just water and the seed of the plant you want to grow. They also need a special item that is usually slightly harder to get. In our case, raw ironwood materials. In order to account for this, I use the time-tested just automate it with DML method, and ignore the fact that there's probably going to be a massive problem with how slow the pristine matter is produced later on. Anyway, I then spent the next hour actually making the Essentia pod seeds, which was a process that involved far too much purple goo overflowing from my crucible for my taste. With all the seeds obtained, I began construction of the apparatus, and let me tell you, I've never been happier to see Ender.io's conduit setting copier device in my entire life. After spending a few hours troubleshooting conduit filters, the time came for the second part of the apparatus to be installed, as Essentia pod production is only half the story. I mean, they have to be processed into crystals somewhere, right? Unfortunately, the method of processing is very, very expensive due to the sheer amount of mithrilium involved. So I went and made the mithrilium chicken I had been told exists back in episode 2 to kinda wash over that problem. After I had more mithrilium than I knew what to do with, I could get back on my way making a stack of Essentia crystallizers through the core of the apparatus, then hooking them up to the pod production, then attaching them to a drawer network. I really want to reiterate how glad I am that Essentia pods exist, because this process would have been like 10 times more expensive and significantly harder to automate if I had to line up like 100 mithrilium Essentia smelters and have to spit out their magic juice all over my base. I've always said that thinking ahead is a good idea, so I'm going to go one step further than just automating all the types of Essentia. I'm going to use the Essentia for the reason the quest book has me automating it in the first place. Basically, the sort of climax of this chapter is the construction of the Tree of Life, an extremely expensive multi-block that makes a buttload of power. One of the core blocks this multi-block is made of is the Stone of Aura, which is made of a V condensate of every type of V. What is a V condensate? About 5,000 V crystals shoved together into a compressor. So, Essentia, the Stone of Aura, requires about 5,000 of every type of V crystal. Yeah, this was really not a fun process. I mean, I already had all the crystals. The apparatus exists for a reason. It was just filtering and routing the right crystals into the quantum compressor and making sure I wasn't feeding it more than I needed to that was really difficult. Hey, Pun, remember when you made that space station assembler and warp core and all that other cool space stuff? Are you going to actually use it? No. I accidentally stared into the void for too long, and it told me I needed to make as many ME storage components as fast as possible. Other planets can wait. I need to make the fastest automation the world has ever seen. Okay, what the fuck am I talking about? Well, when I was browsing through the blocks needed to build the Tree of Life, I saw this custom block called Innerved Skystone. A lot of its constituent materials looked weird, including some that need me to go into space, so don't worry, that's gonna happen. But in general, nothing caught my eye. Until I saw that each set of 12 blocks requires 4 16,384X ME storage components. So that is 4 components that can store 16,384 bytes of something. I don't really understand how ME storage components are actually formatted. Anyway, I need a few hundred Innerved Skystone, so my rough math estimates that I'll need around 42 of these components. That doesn't seem so bad, right? Wrong. 42 of these things require 91.5 thousand of the most basic tier of ME components, meaning I'll need at least that many logic processors. The sheer cost of this operation is so staggering, I actually used the in-game crafting calculator to figure it all out before proceeding with anything, because as I've previously proven, my mental math is not up to the task here. The solution to this dilemma it turns out, is just a spam passive automation, because at the end of the day, if the raw materials only require EMC, it doesn't matter how long each individual process takes as long as you paralyze. So on the roof of my mythic miner area, I set up a temporary loan platform and get down to business. It's funny how despite this recipe being expensive, the actual cost is negligible. Like, despite it costing so much and taking so much time, at the end of the day, I'm still producing more resources than it takes to craft all the components per like an hour. After spending a few dozen hours AFK, I finally have all the components I need. But that doesn't mean the mass crafting is over. An Nerve Skystone also requires a number of ME controllers, which I would have really loved to use for their intended purpose so I could have even more channels, but I guess putting them in here will work fine too. Outside of the ME controllers and storage components, the other parts of the Nerve Skystone are far easier to gather, or are at least less resource intensive. The next resource I decided to gather is the Thaumic Citrus, which requires me to participate in the best mechanic this game has ever seen, forestry tree breeding. This time though, it's interesting because all the trees grow fruit. I have never been so tired of citruses in my entire life. An Nerve Skystone also requires another fruit, the Panacea, but it can be produced with DML, so it's sort of a pushover compared to the Thaumic Citrus. Interestingly, it looks like the only way I can finish the Nerve Skystone recipe is by going into space. Does this mean it's finally time for... Are you going to be disappointed if I said, but before I actually go to space, I need to do some preparation first? Because if so, I have some bad news for you. I don't really need to do much though, just assemble a space station and shove it into a box so I can ship it off into orbit on my spaceship. And boom! I'm in the middle of a vast sea of stars. Is it the Milky Way? I don't think so, but that doesn't matter, because this warp drive I've just gone and set up is about to send us to our first planet, Hator. A quick note here, there are actually two ways to get to planets at this point in the game. The manual method, where you warp into high orbit then send down your ship, and the B-gate, which works similarly to the warpers I was using earlier in this episode, only with a different multi-block. I've chosen the raw advanced rocketry method because I don't want to have to deal with the costs of making the warpers, and in all honesty, a lot of advanced rocketry hate is kind of exaggerated. Like, I don't understand why people don't like using this method, to be honest. Anyway, after landing on Hator, I wander around a little, kill some of the locals, you know how dimension exploration goes. After a little bit, I gather some special items and craft the Trinity Callstone, which allows me to go to the planet's spindle, which is something I need from each planet in order to make the Nerve Skystone. I won't necessarily be detailing the specifics of each puzzle unless they're highly interesting, because a lot of them are just gather strange items A, B, and C from around the dimension, and then just crafting a Callstone. After some more wandering, I locate some fiery pyrite, which is one of the series of blocks that can be found on each planet that is important to progression. I mine it with a tinker's pickaxe I cobbled together out of netherite because my own pickaxe actually wasn't strong enough to mine it, which is a first. Fiery pyrite in hand, I hot-stepped over to Ptah, P-T-A-H, I'm not really sure how that's pronounced, the next planet on our bucket list. And, okay, this entire planet is made of obsidian. Interesting. Turns out that Ptah's equivalent to fiery pyrite, travertine, is buried somewhere in the obsidian, so I'm going to skip gathering it for now because that sounds like a chore. But hey, the puzzle wanted a bunch of blood magic reagents. Woohoo! The Pharaoh's Callstone wasn't anything too special aside from the spindle it gave me, so I packed up my things, jumped in my ship, warped over to Oi, and what the... Oi is the most miserable, inhospitable, and dreary floating piece of rock in existence. The entire planet looks like it had been the site of some nuclear war, because I don't even know how a wasteland that is so unforgivingly depressing could otherwise exist. Supporting that theory, actually, is the fact that as soon as I enter the atmosphere, I start being irradiated. So that's really cool. Exploring was about as difficult as you'd expect, with the only things of note being a cool fight with the Skeleton King and spending an hour gathering radioactive fuel so I can make the Callstone for the spindle, which comes with a fun boss fight too. After that ordeal, I sure hope the next planet's a little more welcoming. Europa, or as I like to call it, the Blue Fog Planet, is very cold. It is also littered with Botania runes, which is interesting. Much to my delight, Europa doesn't have some insane search around the world for 500 hours fetch quest thing going, and I actually managed to get out of there with a spindle in no time and continue on to Osiris, which is one of my favorite dimensions. Osiris is themed around forges, and the fact that forges are operated by bees, which I find very cool. Other than the occasional patch of radiation, exploring the dimension was a breeze and I got the spindle in no time. Phalasair, on the other hand, was a completely different story. Basically, not only was the dimension very dark, completely made of dark blocks, and filled with water and vertical slopes, The puzzle involved a rather lengthy bee breeding process, which I would usually appreciate, but having to breed bees for a planet puzzle whose resources will probably only be used once make it less fun. Eventually though, the Phalanstère spindle is acquired. Orcus, the next planet, is essentially Phalanstère Light. It's flatter, with an easier puzzle, but still a giant dark planet filled with nothing but sadness. The callstone for its puzzle was pretty interesting though, because it actually required me to use it in the deep dark, and it summoned a strange snail. Yeah, I think I'm beginning to lose the plot here too. Coming upon the tail end of my planet-hopping career, Haumea is a pleasant contrast from the misery of the last two planets, instead being what is essentially a very large mushroom island. Unfortunately though, its puzzle blows ass and involved way too much bewitchment imp summoning for my liking. Like, seriously, why does it take so much alter energy just to summon an imp? Regardless, the Demonologist Callstone was crafted, and I got my second to last spindle. Now, the last planet of my travels is a little different than all those that preceded it. Sedna is probably the most important planet at this stage in the game and unlocks so much it's hard to explain just how important getting there is. Getting there is also a little different than normal, as I can't just warp there with my space station all willy-nilly. My warp's controller needs an artifact to tell it where to go. The Sedna artifact is very expensive. That sentence is the biggest understatement of all time. What if a recipe required more blood magic will than you thought existed and more eternal dragonfire than you thought you could make? Wait, eternal dragonfire? Like the stuff that made dreaded steel such a pain to craft? Yes, this recipe needs even more than I did back then. If you have it, this recipe needs it. No, this recipe wants it. Anyway, while I ignore the dragonfire problem for the moment, the blood magic will is needed to make will crystal clusters out of will crystals. I've had the crystals automated forever, but the actual will cost, that is the energy stored in my Tartaric gem, is insane. Yeah, so I ended up spending a lot of time murdering things in a battle tower. Is there a better approach to gathering will than this? Probably, but I'm too locked into the grind for that right now. Turns out I'm stupid, and eventually I realized that these bug guys summoned by a callstone button sitting in the overworld fill up my gem like a fourth of the way upon each kill, so that sort of expedites the process a little. Anyway, with all the will crystal clusters gathered, I throw them into a dragonfire crucible and start pumping it with all the dragonfire I passively produced while planet hopping. Sure, it wasn't enough, but with divine shards and nether stars, that problem goes away and I have a bunch of constructs of will. So these aren't the Sedna artifact. Yeah, they actually make up a catalyst to summon a meteor that summons a block that's needed in crafting the Sedna artifact. Sorry for the confusion. Anyway, I combine the constructs together along with a block of dragon scales to make the draconic fabrial. I don't know what a fabrial is, but it sounds cool. Continuing on, the Mark of the Following Tower is a rather infamous blood magic ritual that summons a meteor above where the ritual structure is set up. Certain items can be sacrificed to the ritual in order to change the size or contents of the meteor. Thankfully, the ritual structure isn't doomed, as intercepting the meteor before it makes landfall is as simple as just placing a block in its way, so after a little bit of ritual configuration, I've got a load of meteoric dragonstone, which just so happens to be the primary component of the Sedna artifact. After a quick infusion ritual, the artifact is crafted and I retreat up into my space station to jump into warp speed. And yeah, here we are, Sedna. Wow. It looks like the bottom of my freezer. It even has the freeze pops and everything. So, what is the point of going to Sedna? Like, what does it unlock that makes it worth going to? Other than the last spindle I need to make the Tree of Life, it also allows me to collect and produce Sednite, which is a very important metal that both unlocks new recipes and makes old recipes more efficient. The ore itself is very rare on the planet, and the best way to make it is from large crystals found on the planet's surface. That being said, the machine that is capable of doing so needs a little bit of Sednite in its construction and is very, very expensive, so for now I'll prioritize Sedna's puzzle. Solving the puzzle was rather simple, merely being a matter of bee breeding, so once the spindle was obtained, I could start making some spindle rings, which are a combination of all the planet's spindles. The production of spindle rings allows me to finally craft the Unnerved Skystone, which actually feels sort of crazy, seeing as it took so much time and resources to gather all the ingredients for these blocks, but yeah, they're crafted. Also, remember the fiery pyrite and how I said that there was a rock like that can be found on each planet? Well, you probably noticed I haven't found any of those rocks. Turns out they are all just nearly impossible to find because they have such a low generation rate underground. So instead, I just used a spindle ring to craft them, because you can just do that apparently. Is it time to build the tree yet? Nope. This is the Azasha channel, remember? That means I've got to go on at least another tangent before we get back on track. This tangent being the automated production of Sedna. In theory, the automation isn't difficult, it's just the 6 crystals, which do have EMC, iron ore, some plasma, and boom, you've got Sedna. Unfortunately, the cost comes from the machines. Dark Soul machine chassis are unbelievably expensive, and I need to start automating them now. Except I'm not, because, going on a completely other tangent is a much better idea. Basically, we're going to make fusion electromagnets, because I'm going to need them eventually, and I may as well start producing them now because they share some resources with the Dark Soul machine chassis. Step 1, copper solenoids. Not sure why they haven't been already automated, because they're used in pretty much everything, and having to craft them every 5 seconds is very annoying. Next up are Nuclearcraft chassis. These would be incredibly expensive, but I've already automated Gaia Spirit ingots, so it's really just a matter of setting up some crafting recipes. Steel chassis, the next tier of Nuclearcraft chassis, are a little more expensive, but don't require anything too crazy. They just sort of remind me that I really should have made Flux Electrum automation a base-wide operation. I also automate Arcane Constructs, which is a slightly more involved process, but their special Meatballcraft recipe makes it so 90% of all their constituent parts are made in the Mythic Miners. On the other hand, automating Blood Magic's imbued slates was far from simple, as the Blood Altar is generally something that you can't passively automate. I basically end up running this awkward vertically stacked altar tower underneath my main altar that uses Ender IO's filters to ensure I'm not taking slates out before they've been properly imbued with blood, but whatever. Using the previously automated items, I automate fusion electromagnets. Woo! I think it's time to start automating things of actual importance, starting with the rather simple Soulless machine chassis from Ender IO, different than the Dark Soul machine chassis. Then Ice and Fire arcane mechanisms, that is an ice arcane mechanism and fire arcane mechanism, not like arcane mechanisms from Ice and Fire. Yeah, the naming is getting a little complicated right now. Anyway, both of those needed their own arcane autocrafter, which I assure you was very fun to fit into the already cramped automation area. You might not believe this, but the Dark Soul machine chassis needs dreaded steel plates in order to be crafted. Yeah. That means I need more dragon fire. How is this still a problem? Anyway, after ending several dragon bloodlines, I managed to make my first chassis. Now I'm just gonna let this thing produce passively because it will take a long time for all the chassis to be produced for Sedna production. In the meantime, I think it's finally time to build the Tree of Life. With all the difficult to obtain blocks already gathered, all I had to do was some chiseling to have all the materials I needed. I don't really like using auto-build for multi-blocks, but this is one of those cases where attempting to build it manually would be a huge pain in the neck. So yeah, here's the Tree of Life. It's not functional yet though, as I need to feed it energy eggs before it can produce energy. Energy eggs, big surprise, laid by energy chickens, whose own egg is contained within the Energy Callstone. The Energy Callstone was sort of an operation to obtain, as it required that I kill these special Ender triplet guys summoned by a previous Callstone I just had floating out in the end, but I didn't actually have enough of the guys, so I had to go and duplicate them until I had enough of their drops to craft the Callstone. After gathering the bubble banners I needed, I crafted the Energy Callstone, flew to Sedna and activated it, netting me an Energy Chicken egg, which I placed in a new coop for automatic eggs, which I began feeding into the Tree of Life. Now, how much energy does the Tree of Life create? A lot. And I mean a lot. To be specific, 4 million RF a tick. That would be more power than my base could possibly consume, but it turns out Sedna production is very power hungry. Essentially, Sedna production requires 2 machines, the plasmatic condenser and the plasmatic controller. The condenser makes the Sedna out of the crystals, iron, and plasma like I mentioned before. This plasma is produced in the plasmatic controller at extreme power costs. Seeing this, I decided that the best place to put this setup would be at the top of my reactor stack, as it has a direct connection to my central power line, but it also has a lot of extra power just running through it due to the reactors. I also maybe put the plasmatic condenser there because its entire core is made of radioactive materials, and the radioactive scrubbers are in the same chunk, but that doesn't matter. Now, I know you might take issue with the way I'm routing plasma to the condenser because it uses a lot more pipes than necessary, but this looks cooler than a single pipe, and aesthetics is obviously more important than trivial things like TPS. The number one Meatballcraft tip right here, definitely. But I don't actually automate the setup yet, which kind of speaks for how much I hate progressing and love doing some random side projects. This time it's building an actual XP farm because I haven't had one of those apparently. Next up is something I'm pretty sure everyone is excited for, fast eternal dragonfire production. Yeah, turns out boss statues can be smelted into divine shards, and those statues are made of dreadium and abyssinite crystals, which can be made from resources I'm passiving with mystical agriculture. As for the nether stars I'll need, those can be grown with mystical agriculture way faster than they can be made with DML, so I make an isolated MA setup just for them by my divine shard automation. Would you look at that? I'm finally producing Ember Fire faster than the slowest slug in a triathlon. Still procrastinating on actually automating Sedna, I decided to do some bee breeding. Well, not really bee breeding, more like trait isolation and gene modification. Basically, while exploring all those planets, I encountered a lot of different bees, some of which might actually be useful later on. I think it'll be good to automate them. The breeding process did take 4.5 hours to complete, but look at all these cool automation modules. Damn! Anyway, I've been delaying it long enough. Time for passive Sedna, which is really just a process of sticking some ore processing to the condenser's output. Yeah, it was that simple. Now that Sedna is automated, we've reached the final challenge in this chapter, making the Singularity Master book. Naturally, the first step is to make a bunch of singularities. It's kind of in the name. The other resources were simple enough, seeing as I'm already producing MOX fuel on Sedna. There were these weird ender cores though, not expensive, just annoying to activate because they had to experience an ender crystal or something. Weird feature. The last resource I needed was the Soul Stone, which is a combination of all those stones that could be found on the planet / made with a spindle ring if you were too lazy to go and spend 8 hours trying to find them naturally. The problem with the Soul Stone though was the way the stones were combined. Thaumcraft infusion. Yep, back to juicing materials and hoping that the infusion altar doesn't decide to explode. Thankfully, the infusion went perfectly and I managed to craft the Singularity Master book without any... What? The chapter isn't over yet? That wasn't the final item? So apparently, the Singularity Master book only provides the knowledge on how to craft the items that unlock chapter 4. It doesn't actually do so itself. In all honesty though, the 2 items I needed to craft recipes were sort of trivialized by the fact I've done a lot of gathering and exploring, as pretty much every item in the recipe was already accounted for or could be made out of items I already had. So after another 20 minutes of scrambling around my base, shoving random junk into machines, I crafted both the Twilight Croc and my first Realm Stone, ushering chapter 4. Holy shit, we've done it! Chapter 4! I'm gonna be honest, I didn't even ever expect to be writing this. As soon as I finished chapter 3, life got kind of busy and just writing the script for this video became something of a chore. I'm really enjoying the pack, but these past few months have just been really chaotic. If you stuck around, thank you so much. I'm glad you're enjoying the series. And don't you worry, Meatballcraft chapter 4 will be happening. It might take a month, it might take half a year, I don't know, but it will happen. Have a good day, thank you for watching, and I'll see you... I'm gonna say soon, but that's probably not true. I'll see you sometime.